Well, good afternoon. I am Steve Pyne, and welcome to A Great Innovation. Basically, I'd like to talk about what happened when a great civilization met a great natural phenomenon. And in a sense, neither was the same afterwards. One of many paradoxes about the canyon is that it was discovered by Europeans very early, in 1540. The canyon was the first great natural feature of North America to be discovered, the Colorado River, the first major river, 138 years before Niagara Falls, 267 before Yellowstone, 300 before Yosemite. It was rediscovered by Spaniards in the 1770s. American trappers operating out of Taos knew about it, called it the Big Canyon. They were guides for the Army Corps of Topographic Engineers in their various surveys across the Colorado Plateau, all of which told them to avoid the area, which they did. And it's one of the interesting features of the canyon that you don't see it until you're on the rim. A mountain range, a river, you can see and anticipate an event. You don't see it until you're there. When I worked on the North Rim, the entrance station is 13 miles from the rim, from Bright Angel Point. One of the most common questions we were asked is, where is the Grand Canyon? You don't see it until you're there. But then in 1857, for a variety of reasons, the Corps of Topographic Engineers made a direct expedition up the Colorado River to test it as a route for transport and to see what they could make of the Big Canyon. This was the Ives expedition. They did take this steamboat from Yuma up to Black Canyon, where it crashed. They got out, made their way along the South Rim to Diamond Creek. They went down to the main Colorado River at Diamond Creek, then came back. These were some of the images from Ives. Ives had previously, his previous assignment for the Corps was to look at Big Prairie in southern Florida, so quite a contrast for the guy. They had two Germans who did most of the technical work at the time. One, von Eglefstein, was their cartographer. He came up with some innovative ways to imagine and represent the topography, but he also did this drawing from Diamond Creek, sort of channeling Gustave Doré, perhaps, certainly German Gothicism of the time. His fellow German, Heinrich Mühlhausen, married the personal secretary of Alexander von Humboldt. So he knew Humboldt and came with Humboldt's personal blessing. He had been on the Whipple survey earlier, and Whipple sourly declared that Mühlhausen never painted anything accurately except a Navajo blanket. Nonetheless, this is his rendition of the Grand Canyon at Diamond Creek, the first painting, European painting we have of what it looked like. And the star of the expedition, the one who really saw value in it, was John Newberry, one of the early Corps of American geologists. This was his stratigraphic column. Others may have thought it Gothic, gloomy, bizarre, uninhabitable. Newberry thought it was a geologist's paradise. Nowhere else in the world could you see what this young science, I mean, the name had only been created in 1783, what this young science stood for. But you have to put them all together. And what was the collective judgment? Well, we've already heard Ives, in writing the report, announced that theirs was the first and would doubtless be the last party of whites to ever visit this profitless locality. No different than the previous Europeans encountering it. They did not have a frame really for understanding it or for bringing together multiple perspectives on it. Well, that changes in the post-Civil War period. John Wesley Powell, as you've heard, makes the first descent through the canyon region by boat going downriver, where Ives was trying to go upriver. The Army, never one to forego a second chance, sent Lieutenant Wheeler on his expedition, one of the four great surveys of the American West, to recreate Ives's expedition. They did it by hand by rowing and towing the boats up to Diamond Creek, sort of re-met Ives in spirit. There's Wheeler in the center with the plaid shirt. Behind him, looming over him, is G.K. Gilbert, a geologist who had trained under Newberry, came with Newberry's notes and maps, and would later join the Powell Survey and USGS. And then Powell went back to try to do a better job, this time making the full traverse of the canyon, and then combining the two expeditions into one narrative, the exploration of the Colorado River in 1875, and gave us the adventure story and the sort of romantic context narrative by which we still understand the river. And river and rim are two very different perspectives. He also brought Thomas Moran to it. And the Moran we see in the atlas is a very peculiar Moran. It is unlike really any of his other canyon art. Moran had made a name for himself nationally on the Hayden expedition to the Yellowstone, 1872, and produced a number of paintings, one of which was the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And Powell said, "You want to see a Grand Canyon? I'll show you one. This is not a big canyon anymore, it's a Grand Canyon. I want you to do this." And so he produced this sort of grand, almost operatic canvas. And as Mark notes, this is no single view. This is a composite. Moran was very much a transcendentalist in the Emersonian tradition. And Emerson said, words are signs of natural facts are signs of spiritual facts. So what ties this together is the spirit, in a sense, behind it, represented by all that virga and rain and mist. So in his mind, he is representing the canyon in an appropriate way. Powell's expeditions expanded into a fuller survey of the region. Gilbert transferred over to Powell, 1875, along with Clarence Dutton. Clarence Dutton had been a Yale graduate, joined a Connecticut volunteer regiment during the Civil War. During the war, he then transferred over to the regular Army, Ordnance Corps, and stayed with the Army for the rest of his career. But he became self-trained in geology, was particularly interested in volcanics, and in 1875, he met and conversed with Powell, another former artillery commander, and convinced the Army to transfer him over to the civilians for summer field work for the next 15 years. In 1879, the various surveys were consolidated into the U.S. Geological Survey. Gilbert and Powell were both members, and Dutton continued to be seconded out for work. William Holmes was also a part of this. He had been a part of the Hayden survey, now joins the USGS, and Clarence King, the first director of the survey, sent them out to the canyon to continue to finish the work they had done under the Powell survey. And it was eventually published under Powell's directorship. Well, there's a way of thinking about this. One of the mysteries, it seems to me, as a non-professional geologist about the canyon is why a river, which is flowing north to south, more or less, decides it's going to go east-west, cross-grain to the country. It would seem to be illogical. How did this happen? But in a sense, in a metaphoric sense, that's also what happens with Western Civ. It had been content to flow along the sides of this region, not seeing anything of value. Suddenly, it makes this remarkable shift and decides to encounter it head on, going in a sense cross-grained, which will force it to reevaluate how it thinks and operates in that context. And in a short period of time, this small group of people will invent a narrative, an aesthetic, and a national significance for the canyon that it had not had. This is, in fact, an elite creation. And we'll come back to that later. And that results 1882, publication of the monograph and atlas. The monograph itself had been published as part of the annual reports for the USGS the year before, but now it is republished in separate edition. And Mark has already stolen my thunder on this, or I'm echoing his, that one of the interesting features about the view from Point Sublime looking east are these two characters, the only characters we see in any of it. And I've always interpreted that to mean Dutton and Holmes, that tag team doing their work, the two of them combining to create these extraordinary panoramas. So what is the theme of, let's look at the tertiary history now as literature. What is its theme? Its theme is erosion. That's announced right on the first, essentially the first sentence. Erosion is a geologic force. What kinds of things are manifest when you erode? But also as an aesthetic process. What aesthetically can be created and how might we understand those outcomes of erosion? The narrative frame is a series of great erosional episodes in time. And the organizing principle is evolution. Darwin had published The Origin of Species, 1859. Evolutionary thought was permeating everything, not in the Darwinian sense of it necessarily, but in various culturally processed and reformatted, recoded forms, if you will, the most prominent of which was by Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher and popularizer. I'm trying to think of someone maybe comparable today, maybe Richard Dawkins. Spencer was far more pervasive in his influence. Extraordinary ability to amass all the cultural memes and principles of the day, using evolution as a universal, grand, unifying theory of everything. All right? We'll come back to him in a little bit more. Dutton did 3 studies of the Colorado Plateau. All of them had a volcanic feature, as well as others. The first was the high plateaus of Utah, and all of these contrast. There's competing processes of erosion and volcanism. The high plateaus are high in part because they haven't eroded yet, and part of that is because they're encrusted with a heavy epidermis of lava. Mount Taylor and the Zuni Plateau, the opposite. Erosion has gone so far that it's stripped off all of the former coverings of volcanism, and we're left with these sort of chimneys where the lava came out. And then in the middle, we have the Western Grand Canyon. And in some ways, if you wondered, why is there so much about volcanism in the tertiary history, which for most visitors is not a feature at all, this is why. This was Dutton's geologic particular interest, and it fits this other triptych, if you will, of studies. And so we have lots of geologic maps. Check the atlas. We have lots of panoramas. We have lots of other smaller features. And of course, one of the great moments where volcanism and river interact at the Toroweap area. And again, we'll come back to that. So what is the geographic frame for the tertiary history? It's essentially this: the high plateaus, the Great Rock Staircase, this terracing of former, by erosion of former strata, and the realization that the Grand Canyon is carved out of the southernmost of the high plateaus. Actually, four plateaus geologically, so you map the faults to designate sort of the east-west zone, and on the east you have the Kaibab monocline, the East Kaibab monocline in place of the fault. So that's sort of the geographic framework. What about the geologic framework? Erosion. So we have that great unconformity at the bottom of the canyon, which separates all the Precambrian rock from the Paleozoic rock. And we have a more recent and in many ways ongoing erosion of the Mesozoic strata, what Dutton called the Great Denudation. And he makes this point that the canyon itself, we think of as so much erosion, is trivial compared to these former ages. So these are these two immense, and then between that and the Paleozoic, we see the Grand Canyon making its presence as yet another in this whole series of great erosions. All right, so we make a series of journeys of discovery is how the book is organized. Kanab was the base camp for the Powell survey in southern Utah. And so the high plateaus end, and the tertiary history, in a sense, ends looking over the region. And you see this sort of hazy outline and suggestions in the distance to the south. So you begin, in a sense, picking up the Markagunt Plateau down to Kanab. Then you journey to Zion, and that becomes a study in erosion of cliffs and features. Journey to Toroweep, which becomes a study of valleys and gorges, sort of spiced for Dutton with all of the volcanics of the area. And then you go to Point Sublime, which Dutton names, where all of these other features come together. This is where the grand synthesis will take place. So Dutton, among many perhaps endless quotes, notes that those who have studied the area consider the canyon the most sublime thing on earth, but he notes it is not that because of its magnitude, not because it's long, not because it's deep, not because it's wide, but because it integrates so many different kinds of features in one great ensemble. And that is what Dutton's book is going to do, is to create that ensemble, beginning with studies of erosion of cliffs in the canyon and around it. And the traverse to Zion provides many examples of this. And he contemplates how do you understand this as architecture, as well as how do you understand the geologic processes of erosion which created it. Going to Toroweep becomes a study in canyons, gorges, valleys, not just the central gorge, inner gorge, but Kanab Creek, Canyon, the Winkarit region with its widening valleys, ending in this immense drop-off at Toroweep. And interestingly enough, this is taken atop Vulcan's throne, which is a cinder cone. So this is where, again, the volcanism and erosion for Dutton and Holmes sort of come together very nicely. All right, so Point Sublime, you're going to put it all together. And the geologic history, you're going to tie all these different fragments of information and items together, and we're back to Spencer. Spencer was enormously popular. I can't think of anyone today who would claim a comparable stand. He was the one who proposed for, not just for literate people, but generally was accepted. He's the one who coined survival of the fittest. Many other terms that we've identified with evolution were the creation of Spencer. In 1882, he makes a great author tour of the US. So he's feted throughout all the centers of, well, this is the same year the Tertiary History is published. So Spencer is a manifestation, if you will, of an organizing principle. And the essence of Spencerian evolution was that evolution, which is universal, can apply to all things, is a progression from a state of incoherent homogeneity to increasingly coherent heterogeneity. And that is exactly what we see in Dutton's book, beginning with this hazy outline, or in another form, the gloomy gorge, which you cannot differentiate, which you cannot parse, which you can't really see. How this is going to go from that state of blurriness and gloominess into coherent clarity. Heterogeneity, complexity, yet integrated. And that provides the structure of the book. William James satirized Spencer in a great comment. He said, evolution is a change from no-howish, unattackable all-alikeness to a somehowish and in general talk-aboutable all-alikeness by continuous stick-togetherations and something else-ifications. So what made Spencer so popular was that he's taking all the memes and phrases and free-floating concepts out there, and he's found a way to bring them all together in a way that ultimately is cultural gibberish. It made sense at the time. To us today, we would probably agree with James. Anyway, Dutton was a part of this. He was an educated guy. He was a literate guy. Interesting polymath in many ways. He was a very successful scientist. Remember, belonged to the National Academy of Sciences, and an Army officer, a career Army officer. So at Point Sublime, he brings together the geology, and he traces out the evolutionary history of the tertiary history of the Grand Canyon District. So all the pieces come together. And then for the aesthetics, he traces the evolution of a scenic day. So it begins, how else? With a kind of shadowy, pre-dawn gloom and haze. And as the sun comes out, it becomes more and more clear, sharper, and the various possibilities reach a climax by the end of the day. So he uses Sublime in this way to tie it all together. One of his great insights, however, is to recognize the Grand Canyon is not like anything else in Western tradition. That's why it was repeatedly overlooked or rejected. He's going to take that on directly and say, it's an innovation in our modern ideas. Not just alien, not different, but an innovation that we should embrace and will ennoble our concepts. But like all innovations, it takes time, care. It has to be cultivated. And the lover of nature, normally raised in traditions of landscape art and poetry, writing about natural history of various kinds, will come to the region, see it's strange, it'll be a shock, it'll just be easy to dismiss. And he says, he grapples directly with it and says it has to be cultivated. And that is what he and Holmes, and in a different sense, Powell, are doing. They are showing us how we can change what we thought were the standards of landscape art and appreciation, and we can create something new out of that in unexpected ways. So again, this was an elite creation. When we think about places to which we become attached, the normal path is to have people live there for a long time. And they accrue stories. They name places. They associate values with every thing. And then the intellectual, the poet, the singer, whatever, comes together and reshapes that in an artful way. And so it moves out of sort of folklore and tradition and occupies a kind of elevated place that other people can relate to and appreciate. That's not what happens for Western Civ at the Grand Canyon. They suddenly came upon it, engaged with it, made something, and then it has to be disseminated through popular culture. The railroad was critical in doing this. The Santa Fe didn't have much economic value across a lot of the Colorado Plateau stretch, so it was interested in promoting tourism at the canyon, ran a line to the canyon. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt, then president, comes and announces it's the one great sight every American should see. So in 40 years from Ives, 20 years after Dutton publishes, it had gone from a place to be ignored and bypassed to a place that should be sought at as a great emblem. This is what America had instead of Eiffel Towers and cathedrals and coliseums. And then the National Park Service becomes a medium for disseminating this. And the early artists continued to be active in it. Here's Moran with his two daughters. The Santa Fe gave him a rail pass, so he could come as often as he wanted, and they were happy to help promote his art. And I did a quick sort of counting of paintings for the canyon down in the graph below, and Moran is in orange. And you can see he dominates. For 5 decades, he is active, and in many ways, except for the last, the most dominant feature. So that is the view most of us see, and it's not the one, unfortunately, in the atlas, which is a very different kind of moraine. Meanwhile, Henry Holmes went on to various administrative jobs in DC, ending with the National Portrait Gallery and National Gallery of Art. And in 1918, he assembles canyon art as a way of promoting Grand Canyon as a national park. So the Grand Ensemble, Dutton and Holmes did it. They brought all these pieces together in a way that made sense to their time and continued. But there was also an ensemble of history, of opportunities. This occurred during a second great age of discovery, which the movement west in the US was an important part. Westward expansion, search for a national identity, having institutions that could both fund and then promulgate material. Landscape art. This is an era when landscape art is very popular. Artists can make international reputation for themselves by landscape art. A new science, geology, found in the canyon a perfect expression of what it was about. And interestingly enough, that merges with evolutionary thought so that it is tapped into all kinds of science-informed themes of the age, and then you have the right kind of personalities. In the 20th century, that sort of disentangles. We have a third age of discovery, the deep oceans, Antarctica, interplanetary space. How does the Grand Canyon measure as a geologic or aesthetic feature compared with the with canyons on Mars, the outer moons? Frontiers over. The canyon has become a World Heritage Site. It's moved beyond that. Park Service has become sort of the dominant institution. Landscape art, who's going to paint landscape? Who continues painting landscapes in a serious way? Modernism and postmodernism want nothing to do with it. Certainly don't want to deal with representational art. Geology moved away from grand historical expressions to plate tectonics. Now, as Steve showed so well, plate tectonics is what explains the origin of the canyon. The canyon is not, when I took introductory geology, the Grand Canyon was on the cover. But that was pre-plate tectonics. I'd be very surprised if that would be true today. The elites leave the canyon. It becomes an extremely popular phenomenon, but elites are gone. Instead of following John Wesley Powell down the inner gorge, they're more likely to follow Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, or Sigmund Freud looking at the gorges of the subconscious. Instead of Holmes's panoramas, maybe Georgia O'Keeffe, looking at the Southwest in dramatically different terms. This is where art's going to go. Art and that idea of Dutton and Holmes, sort of that tag team, one looking over the shoulder to the other, they've gone off to different parts of the world. Elite culture returns in the 1960s thanks to the dam controversy, and has remained, redefined the canyon in different ways. So now we even have institutionalized an artist in residence program for the canyon. We're producing lots more stuff, but I would argue of a rather different sort. So the canyon has been remade, continues to be grand, but perhaps in different ways. And you can see that all of the presenters here today have not shown our stuff to one another, so we're tripping over each other in various places. But I would argue that a lot of it now is not to deal with a landscape epiphany, but with an overload of images. And I like Mark Kletz's composite remake of it as a great example of that, how to create a palimpsest, if you will, of all of this stuff, rather than the first revelation. You stand on the rim, bang, there it is. Now I'm going to explain it to you. It's a very different challenge. So I think now the hold of that original elite creation has passed. It's passed for some time. That there is one dominant view, an omniscient view, and that this is how it should be understood. I think we have millions of canyons. each grand in its own way. And I think the enduring legacy of Dutton and his associates is that they convinced us that there was a meaning to be found in the gorges and cliffs, and that this was a place worth cultivating. So we've continued to cultivate it, and it continues to change. The poet Carl Sandburg once observed, "Each man sees himself in the Grand Canyon," and I think that's becoming true, and I would certainly say it was true for me. So with that, thank you.
That was, as expected, fantastic, Dr. Pyne. Thank you so much for giving us our penultimate presentation of the day. Yes, I'm sure there are many questions. You will be the first. Let me first bring the mic to you, though, for our... But look, for the online audiences, they won't hear it.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We have been taking advantage of seeing all of this, so we have some idea, but this adds a lot to our knowledge. And so my big question really is, how does this narrative change when Indians are part of it? And so my husband is a medievalist at Arizona State, and so that history is medieval history.
Yeah.
You start with the Spanish, but of course, people had been going up and down for hundreds of years, if not thousands. And so how does the whole story change? The art at the end, how does everything change when we include Indians? Thank you.
No, that's a great question, and it's a question I did not address in my own study. I was very specific. I'm talking about how one culture, one civilization came to and made sense of it. And so to keep that narrative arc under what I thought was my control and my capacity, I didn't talk about what happened before, and I shut it off before we get to the present. It's enough to talk about it disentangling. I think now what we have is not a dominant view. We have a dominant conviction that this is worth saving. But I think all these visitors see something different. They're not seeing it exactly as Powell or Dutton did. I don't think that's possible anymore. We've changed. This becomes part of that story. I think the idea of creating a grand narrative, embracing all of it, is possible. That's a task before us. Certainly discussing how to integrate. What kind of art could integrate all of these different views that we have now, including indigenous? That's the task we have before us. And I think what I suggest Mark's approach may be part of that. We're creating mosaics and palimpsests. We're not going to create a single view or a single narrative. But that's not a task I took on. I said, I'm not competent to it. That's not what I chose to write about. And I was very explicit. This is not the universal history of the Grand Canyon. This is how one group of people came, found a place that was outside their realm of cultural understanding and interpretation, made sense of it, and then used that to create special definitions, legal, political, and even cultural definitions for that place. And as I say, part of what I find fascinating about it is that it was an elite creation. I mean, they didn't see themselves as imposing this on others. They said, this is worth studying. It's worth making sense of, and we'll show you how you can do it. But it means you have to change. You have to change your expectations about what is sublime and majestic, what is worth studying. And in a sense, that's a task we face now. How we pull that together, I'm not sure. That's for my children and probably my grandchildren. That's also why I have not gone back and tried to extend it, because if I were to carry the story forward, the whole narrative arc falls apart. And for me, I wanted a short book. I wanted it defined. I wanted it, people would read it. They don't read these long things. So that's what I set out. That's what I chose deliberately to do. And part of that is leaving stuff out. And this is how I chose to make that possible for me. And there's certainly lots and lots of other possibilities, and people are I mean, millions, I don't know. How many photos a day on average are taken of the Grand Canyon? I mean, photos, probably a number of photos equal to the number of gnats hovering on a summer day. I know, it's just overwhelming.
Deep
So it
stuff
was
here.
interesting at the end where he merges all that into something else, and that's one solution, but there are lots of others. And excuse me, just a quick second. I've been involved with fire. Most of my stuff has been with fire. I mean, I was at the Grand Canyon for 15 summers on a fire crew in the North Rim. And so that's where I got interested in the canyon as a place, but I also became interested in fire. And I've been interested in all kinds of revivals of cultural burning now as a way of restoring indigenous cultures. They want to reclaim their right and capacity to reinstate burning as they understood it. And so we have all kinds of examples. How do we make this happen? And part of it is you can have the same burn, and every agency, every tribe, every participant can see it differently. What matters is that the burn happened. And we shouldn't be in the business of converting people to one view of what this burn means, because it's going to have all kinds of meanings. What we don't want is to fight over the different meanings and who gets determined to the point where the fire doesn't happen, and then it's just taken over by feral fires because we've surrendered control over it. So if that's a long, I'm sorry, I've been writing fire books. I wrote this 25 years ago, and I decided, I don't know that a codicil is really possible for me. So anyway, that's.
And the reality is, Dr. Pyne, I mean, this is actually, you're really hearkening back to old research right now. I mean, a lot of your more contemporary, more recent work is actually on the Anthropocene and humans' relationship with fire. I mean, that's really sort of what your status is as a scholar these days, correct? I mean, when you're on the circuit doing lectures, you're mostly talking about fire these days, right?
Fire has become a big thing. When I started, nobody was interested in fire. Now the world changed.
And I was rewatching one of your TED Talks on fire recently, and you said, yeah, we have entire academic departments allocated for, hydraulic, for water, for all the other earth elements, but not for the fire element. And I found that very striking and truthful.
The only fire department on the university campus, including ASU, is the one that sends emergency vehicles when an alarm sounds. How did fire disappear? I mean, we're the species monopolist. Fire is what we do. Fire is our ecological signature. It's what we do that no other creature does.
And now for the next
now
4
we don't
hours,
even study it?
talk about fire. We could do that.
Anyway.
Awesome. Any other questions for Dr. Pyne, the postmodernist here? And I'm sure he would entertain questions on fire as well.
Probably not of interest to this group.
No, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you actually do contemplate fire. Probably not with the same profundity of you, Dr. Pyne. But real quick.
Can we just make it Steve?
Yeah, yes, Steve.
Thank you.
Steve, it's an honor to be standing in your presence, Steve. Real quick, that was the penultimate presentation. Thank you again. Can we have another round of applause for Dr. Pyne, for Steve?